Okay, so we're going to do the last piece of this. We have created hit boxes, hurt boxes, sensors for our player, for our enemy. I have a head and body sensor for each one of the enemies. For my player, I have a head, a body, and a foot sensor, and then I have a radar sensor. So what we're going to do is we're going to start linking up ways that the player can start checking for some type of collision. And then we can start having that fire. Now, we could set up a system so that it's just automatically checking for any type of collisions, but for the most part, we're not, unless you're really trying to build in some heavy AI stuff, you don't necessarily have to do that. Now, we could have that done, say, in the dynamic creature or in the dynamic class, have some type of system set up where it's going to be checking against all the hitboxes. There is an issue with that, though, and the way that I have it set up is where we're kind of driving through the player, because if you're not careful, you would check multiple times for every time you're running through, say, a dynamic creature or a dynamic, ultimately a dynamic object. Because the player is a dynamic object. These three enemies are dynamic objects. If I was checking through the list for every sensor that is attached to the player against each one of these enemies, and then they're doing that vice versa, we're going to end up checking the same thing multiple times, and there's a lot of redundancy. So in this effort, I'm trying to relieve some of the redundancy, but if we were going to build a more robust game, we would probably have to make some changes on this, and there would have to be a change in design. Okay, now to start off, let's just minimize this because I don't want to scroll the whole way. In our sketch, we have already created this enemies list and we push the enemies in there. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to basically take those enemies, pass them to the player. The player is going to load them into a list, and then in the player's update is going to need to be checking for any enemies that need to be added to the list, and then needs to update enemies that are on the list and see if they need to be removed. Okay, so that it's only ultimately in every state situation that there might be a collision, we're only really having to check the people who should actually be in the process of colliding with the player. Okay, so in order to do this, we need to go to our player and we need to create a couple methods and set up some stuff. Our player has sensors and is also going to have an enemies list. Okay, and that is going to always be the full list of all the enemies. Now, we have to have all the enemies loaded up before we can do this. Okay, and this is just for expedient checking, but if we wanted to do this with other things, we can also push that in there of things to check. So we do want an enemies list, and then we want another one that's going to be for right now we're just checking with enemies, but this will be for enemies, and this could be also for coins and everything. So let's do dynamics to check. Actually, this is a list. This is going to be a list. Okay, so we need to create a method. For our player, what do we want to call it? Ultimately, we're going to be setting this enemies list. How about load enemies? That's Yeah. And we'll have a list of enemies, and then that's going to be this dot enemies, enemies list, load enemies list. Enemies list dot yeah, okay. So that will happen after the player, and then we wanted to basically do the build dynamics to check, and then update them. Build dynamics to check. And that's going to be a fun one. And then update dynamics to check. And this is a little bit of an effort of being optimized. Okay, so we want to have the list of enemies. So then in order to do that, we're going to have to go to the sketch. Sorry guys, the pause button's right there. There we go. Okay, so we're going to the sketch. We've already created the enemies. Now, when we are building the player, we're building enemies. After we're done, we still have a hold of that player. So that would be here, player dot. My brain is not working today. Load enemies list. Load enemies list, and then we're loading those enemies. That's what we want. Okay, so then when we come back into the player, then we're going to want to start being able to check. And we want to check based off of this radar. So it's going to be kind of like we're doing a collision, but really just with the this. So what I want to do is I'm going to go through every enemy, and if they are within a certain distance of my player or this radar, then I will add them to the dynamics to check, and then I can start navigating through those. Okay, so let's do a for of loop. So we're going to do for let enemy of this dot enemies list. So I'm not deleting them off this enemies list. They're going to stay there. All right, so we're checking every enemy, and then we got to check based off of our sensors. So we're building this off of the radar sensor. So the first thing that I'm going to do is we're going to use the new operation, the new function. It's called the find, and it's kind of like using a for of loop, but it's a little bit simpler. It creates like an anonymous function. I can give it just simple criteria to search without having to write a whole bunch into it. So what we're going to do is we're going to find that radar sensor and then assign it just to make it easier for us to write it. So I'm just going to say radar is this dot sensors, and then I'm finding based off of this function. Okay, so I'm going through every single item in the sensors for the player, and I am passing in. So each one of these is going to go through each one. So I need a temporary variable like this let enemy of this list. So I'm saying, hey, check, let's call it a sensor, and then this is a fat arrow. This is not a equals to or greater than. We always read greater than or equals to, so it's not written this way. This is a fat arrow. So it means that I'm passing in sensor into this simple algorithm or function. And what I want to do is I want to check my sensors. Each sensor has a type. I want to check my type against what I know is the name of the radar. Okay. If we get it, then this will return my radar. So let's just quickly try to check that this is happening, which means we're going to need to do this build dynamics to check. And so I'm going to want to do this. In this case, I don't have an update for my player, and I don't want to put it really here because the enemies are not going to be checking it. Okay, so that means that I'm going to have to call my player. The update will start going, but that's going to have to call the update of its super. So we want to go back to the player. The player is going to have their own update. Okay. And then we can call this method, this build dynamics to check. So it'll be this dot build dynamics to check. It's going to run that method. Okay. And then we need to call the super dot update. Okay, there's the radar sensor, so it did find it. Now it is calling that sensor every single time, so that's why everything is slowing down. Console.log is really killing us. Okay, so I don't want to hold this every time. I just wanted to make sure that it was working. Stop. Because I was going through every enemy and then running it, so it was save before we move on. I'm going to refresh. Yeah, I just slowed it down. Let's go. Yeah, I crashed it. Having too much logging in the console. Okay, so that's why I saved right before I try to refresh. Okay, so now that we got the radar, now we need to check the enemy, and the enemies have their own sensors. Right now we just have a head and a body sensor. So we can start actually checking this based off that. We want to check the distance from each of those. So this radar, we're going to need to do another loop. So this is going to be checking for all of the, let's say, the hit boxes of the enemy that we just on this list, the enemy, their sensors. Okay, so it's going to check through each one of those. So each enemy, it's going to go through enemy 1 and then check each one of those hit boxes that they have, the head and the body. Okay, and so we may end up having more. So we're going to build this as if we're going to do this. I want to check the radar. So if radar dot collided with that hitbox. Okay, if that's true and it's returning a type, if that type is equaling head or radar dot collided with that hitbox is body. Okay, if either one of those are true, this is for my enemies. Okay, if we have some type of collision with the radar, I'm just making sure. Then, then we want to push that in the enemies to check, the dynamics to check. This dot dynamics to check. What am I doing? This dynamics to check dot push, and we want to push that enemy. Okay. If it doesn't collide with that header body, we're not putting it in. Then we're going to the next hitbox on the enemy's one. So we're not doing, in this case, the ones that we're checking are only the ones that are potentially close. We could do distances on this too, to just do ones that are roughly, but that's why I built that radar, is that radar is kind of doing the distance. So the distance function's already embedded in here. Okay, so then once we get back through, we went through all the enemies, we have this list of dynamic enemies to check. Okay, now what we're going to need to do is, if our list is greater than 0, okay, so we could do that right here. If this dot dynamics to check, if the length is greater than 0, then that means that we got people that we are potentially colliding with. Okay, so what we need to do is, ideally, we've already dealt with them. So if they've already passed through this circle, we need to remove them because they're still here on the list. Once they pass through, they're still on the list. So we need to remove them away out of this list. Okay, so we're going to have to go through the dynamics to checking each one. So we're going to end up going with that radar again, which now I'm using it twice. That means that this is going to be getting pulled, so I only have to write it once. So I'm going to pull this out, and this is going to become part of instead of me even having to search, I'm pushing this onto the sensors. I might want to redesign this. I was searching, so it's useful, but now if I'm going to have to rewrite it, then that's going to become annoying. So instead of me doing this, I can just hold on to it as I'm pushing it. So I can say this.radar. Let's just do this.head is this, and now I have a hold of it, and then I can push this.head into the sensor list if I ever have to look for it. Same thing here, this.body, and move this, so now I have a hold of it. this.body, this.foot is this. We'll use that method again, though, once we get into some of our different stuff in the states. We may end up having to use that method again. So it's okay that we covered this. And then I need the last one, which is my radar. So this.radar. Okay, so now I don't really need to check. I just have it. But it's not going to be radar. It's going to be this.radar. This.radar. Still works just fine. I have a mistake though somewhere. Let's just double check. It's 4. RADAR. Cause function, verify whether this has collided in it and check the spelling. RADAR. Okay, so before we call this, we're here, console.log this.radar. Froze it again. It does have a hold of it. There's the radar. Radar, vector, color, sensor. We have to refresh. I'm reloading. Okay, it was a spelling mistake. I asked for collided and I put collide. I like collided better, so I'm changing that in my sensor class. Okay, and I got rid of the error. So what I'm doing here is I'm double checking. Okay, so then here, if it's greater than 0, then what do I want to do? Well, I want to check if it's outside of the boundaries of the radar. So I'm using it again. This time I want to use a distance function again. Because I know that it already collided, but now I want to know if it's already outside of it. So I'm going to go for every enemy that's in that list. So for this dot, or let's see, let enemy of this dot dynamics to check. How about object? Because we may end up having coins and stuff that we're removing also. Okay, so we're checking the objects in this dynamics to check. So if they are outside of the range of my circle, so let's build a distance function for that. Distance of this dot radar dot position dot x, this dot radar dot position dot y, object dot position dot x, object dot position dot y. Okay, so if d is greater than this dot radar dot size divided by 2, that means they're outside of that circle area. I need to refresh. So if that's true, then this dot dynamics to check, and I actually want to splice, which means I don't want to do a for of because I actually need the index number. I think I can find the index of that, but I can just easily change this. Okay, so I can just say let index equals 0, and then we are going from index to less than this dot dynamics to check dot length. So we want one less than that, and we're going by ones. So index plus plus, which means that now I can have a hold of this. So the function that we want to do for this is that we are going to splice, which means that we're going to basically cut it into 2 parts, and then we're going to remove a certain number. You can check the references for it, but in this case, we're removing the one that does not fall under this distance. So whatever one, when we're going through this for loop, we don't have that object anymore, so we're going to have to assign it. So we're going to say let object equal this dot dynamics to check at position index. Okay, so whenever object, the distance of that is past the radar from the middle where we set it. So once it's outside of that, then we want to remove it from this list. So we want to remove at index. That's where we want it to start, and we want to remove one item. Okay, so that would keep us from having a huge list. So that is the update dynamics to check. And we want to do this, so this dot update dynamics to check. We want to do this before we are running our states because we want to make sure that those are updating. So let's console.log. We want to see what the length of our dynamics to check is and see if it's zeroing out and it doesn't just keep increasing. Dynamic to check. dynamics. Helps if I write it right. Dynamics to check this dot Okay, so it's working, but it is adding them multiple times. Okay, so let's stop it. It's working, but now it needs to be fixed. If we already have a person in there, then we're going to need to not do it. So we got to match. If I think we can search an array. I forget it right now off the top of my head. I think I have it in my other example though, real quick. It is be under the player. It would be includes. There we go. Yeah, we're just checking if it includes. As long as it doesn't include. So let's go back. Not here. Okay, so we can check if it's collided, and so that's an OR right there. We don't care which one, so in this case I want both of these ORs to be nested, and I want either one. This dot dynamics to check dot includes enemy, as long as it doesn't have that, which means that it's a not operation. So I want either one of these. Either I have a collision with the head of the enemy or the body of the enemy, and it's not already on the list. I want to add it to the list. And then when we come down here, if we're outside of that range, then I want to remove it from the list. So let's go ahead. We want to see that it's not having large numbers. 0, 1, 2, 1, 0, 1. Okay, so that is working now. Okay, which means now we can start modifying the hitbox or the sensors, the radar sensor specifically, to have it so that it's pointing up or down towards the players, and it will put them in. We can start moving them. So now we have a whole system in place, at least for checking for the enemies. We could reset the enemies. We could have them lose some health. We could have them get a force push back. We could start tagging whatever ends up actually being some type of collision. We can start, playing around with those values. All right. So that kind of concludes doing the hitboxes. Now we actually need to start doing power-ups and attacks and stuff like that, which is in the next unit. So good luck. Have fun. Make sure that you get your sensors designed to move so they're the most strategic for when we're jumping to remove and add enemies, and that you have them added for all of the player and all of the enemies. Okay? And you need to have at least 2, so an easy enemy and a difficult enemy. Good luck. Have fun.